Hey, what's up, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in another video. Today we're going to paint this beautiful white lily flower. I've been asked to do this kind of a tutorial, and I find white flowers to be especially fun to paint because the temperature can go either way, so you can end up with some warm shadows, some cool shadows, some neutral shadows, which is often the case, and it's just an interesting process to see. So let's get started with the drawing stage. Of course, I'm going to show you both a black and white and a posterized version of the reference photo. If you want to take a screenshot or whatever, I'm going to link everything down below, but for the purpose of this process, I am using all three types of edited photos to make sure that I see the values more accurately, that I see the colors more accurately, and everything else, just to help me simplify the shapes. Now, I'm following the general shape of the petals. Always try to triangulate, which means every little detail you draw, try and find two places it relates to, and make sure that you're kind of on point. So the tip of a petal works in a diagonal line to another tip of a petal to maybe same line as one of the very center of the petals, let's say. So just make sure that you're on point there with the general proportions. But some part of the fun of painting flowers is that bit of freedom, because if you mess things up just a little bit, no one will really notice in the drawing stage. It is more about the painting, I find, in these kinds of references where you just want to make sure that you get the values right and the colors and everything else. So yeah, here I am drawing some of the shadow pattern. That's probably the most important thing, to really show myself where the light is going to turn to shadow, because that's a big part of what's going to guide me through this process. And here I'm putting in some of those parts. I don't know what they're called in English. I do know what they're called in Hebrew. But yeah, the part that the bees stand on and produce honey from. So yeah, just making sure all the lines are in place, all the half lines of the petals. This petal I just put in there, but I'm actually not gonna paint. I'm gonna ignore it, ignore this flower that's more in the front, completely disregard it. And here you go, this is pretty much what I've got. Feel free to take a screenshot or just pause the video and use this as your drawing reference, of course. But I'm going to get started here with the background wash. Now I want this to be quite a strong blue, and because I'm using hot press paper that doesn't have that much texture, one of the byproducts of using hot press is it's very sensitive to how much water you have, which means you may end up with very uneven washes unless you take some precautions. One of these precautions is to pre-wet the paper so that the paint glides over it freely and dries more evenly. If you've ever painted on hot press paper and you've been having trouble and you don't know why your washes are uneven, or you get tons of cauliflowers, which can be a good thing if you use it as an effect, but if it's undesired, it's not a good thing. So if that ever happened to you and you wonder why that happens, usually it's due to the characteristics of hot press paper. So I tend to err on the wet side of paint, whether that means pre-wetting or it means actually using very thin paint and then slowly darkening it in the same wash, wet and wet. So pretty much the same as wet and wet, as pre-wetting like we did here. Now my blue is a combination of my phthalo blue and my French ultramarine. This is what I do when I try to get kind of a neutral blue in there, but to be honest, in retrospect, the blue is a little warmer than this. So had I wanted to capture the color a bit more accurately, which I don't really care about here, I would have used French ultramarine, just kind of to let you know if you want to vary my mix. But I did take a long time to mix a lot of this paint in advance, so be sure to make sure, because you want to get things done fast once the paper is wet and you don't have as much time to work. Now, one more thing is, this wash needs to be strong enough. Now, I do know I'll probably have to further darken it later on, which is something that happens, probably with a flat wash. But for now, I want to get a good distinction between the wet of the flower and the background. That's what I'm aiming at here. That's my main goal, with the lower section being a little more open for interpretation, especially because I'm removing that flower that's there. I'm not treating it at all. I pretend it doesn't exist. Now, real fast, I'm mixing in a bit of this green. It's a mix of undersea green and sap green, so it has both the greenness and also some of the strength. And I'm doing this shape wet and wet on the left there. Just thought it would be a good chance to get some wet and wet action going, get some smoother edges. And now we're mixing a very dark purple that's a bit more even starting to get close to brown, because these are the stems of the flower. They're very weak in terms of saturation. They're just very dark, close to black actually. So I'm getting some of those in. The paint has been on paper for a while, so I can, if using very thick paint, have it not spread out too much. But this is all about timing, right? If you do this too early, the paint may spread out completely and be you won't be able to control it, right? But yeah, just so it's one of those things you need to have in mind. Like, how wet is the paper? How wet is my brush? How wet is the paint on the palette? All of these things, they do influence the result on paper pretty much, lifting back that excess paint there. And this pretty much ends our first wash. You know, just a few more petals down, not petals, stems down under the flower to justify like where it comes from, you know, because that's what you'll often see. You'll often see these little stems and little details. Now, you don't see some of the mixing. Maybe I'll edit the video, but generally this is where you want to go strong because you want this to last, even though the paper is wet once again. A bit of loose gibberish there doesn't mean anything really. I'm just taking this very loosely, this part of the process, just trying, you know, I'm squinting my eyes, asking myself, does it make kind of sense? Does it look okay? As long as it does, I'm okay with it. I'm not really recreating things to the T. And you will see later on the role of opaque paint as well, just so you know. You can fix a lot of mistakes. Now I'm mixing a bit of gray. That gray will be used for the shadows as a basis for them. And then I also mixed a bit of yellow. And the reason for that is I just wanted to make sure I got the color somewhat in the right ballpark before I'm painting the shadows, because the gray shadows are going to transition directly into the yellow, and I can't afford to waste time mixing the yellow afterwards. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm somewhat in the ballpark before even beginning to apply this wash, because right now we're going to paint that shadowy shape in one go. See, I'm pre-wetting the paper so that I get that smooth edge, and then it's just painting that shape. And that's where, pun intended, the white flowers shine. This is where this subject is really useful, is really good for studying temperatures, because the beginner's tendency is to exaggerate those. So you'll often see white objects with a very blue shadow, very, very blue. That could work depending on the context of the rest of the painting, but very often I see it used in a very amateurish way that leads to a very saturated result. I'm going to film a short video on that. I post it in the next couple of days actually, but it just leads to a very amateurish result. So you want to make sure that your grays are grays whenever they need to be. The beautiful part is you can still play with it. You can still push them to be slightly warmer, slightly cooler. That's the fun of working with gray colors and gray shadows, which again are very common on white objects. Now, you can see a lot of the color variability there. It's a little easier to distinguish. So for example, if you had a very blue subject and you have a shadow on it, it's going to be mostly a dark blue that may be a little cooler or a little warmer. But when the color is white, so the perfect gray is your default shadow, and then you can push that ever so slightly to be cooler and warmer. I find that to be a very fun process, and I will link probably in top right corner or somewhere there the process, another process that really showcases this, how to work with white flowers. It's, I think, one of my best videos so far, and the result is quite realistic there actually. Here as well, to some extent. So I'm taking care of the edges. This is one big shape, remember, don't let the details confuse you. This is just one big shape of shadow, and that's all we're going to worry about. We're not going to worry about the darkest details. We're not going to worry about the sky right now. We're not going to worry about anything else. All we're dealing with right now is that one big shadowy shape. If you squint your eyes, if you look at a posterized photo, you will see it. okay, you will see that one big shape. The only extending shapes out of it are these beautiful shadows of the, whatever, pollens, that's what you call these, I think. So the shadows of the pollens, that's the coolest part there, because it really goes across the leaf, and it's a beautiful effect, tells you the story. And once we put that shadow there too, it will justify an existence of pollens, and you'll see it's a very fun effect to build up, very fun. So yeah, just preparing you for what's to come. A lot of these shadows are in the middle of the petals. That's a very common pattern as well, because what happens is that's where the petal is created, I guess, center outwards, and so that's where it's beveled inside, or it's beveled outside rather, and dip inside. So you get these areas that aren't as exposed to light. Now, which is again a very cool little effect and how it works with the overall shape. Now we're pretty much done with that major shape of shadow. The one thing you'll notice is in it there are areas that are slightly darker and areas that are slightly warmer. Sometimes I will do these immediately in my wash, use wet and wet. Here I left them for later because I had that yellow to deal with, and that's rough. And I didn't want to put too much burden on myself. Now, what you see me do is increasing the contrast with the sky. So I kind of like the contrast as it is. It doesn't have to be darker, but in the reference photo, it's clearly a darker blue for the sky. Now, a darker blue makes the white pop even more. And that actually works really well with that wet and wet green we put earlier. It's just like a mask going over it, and it will look really good, and it will put things in the right context. So one byproduct of that is the areas in the gray shadow that should be darker become even more apparent. And you'll see this in 1 second. Everything in the flower, inside the petals, feels a little lighter because it's all relative, right? There is the accurate, real-world value of everything pretty much, but in the context of the painting and with a lot of artistic freedom, it becomes a lot more contextual very often. And this is what makes a painting sing and really work well. It's how you put everything in the right context together. And very often that's the skill that's missing to a lot of intermediate painters. It's like you get a few sections nicely, but it doesn't work well together. And that's something that you slowly begin to improve with time. Now I'm really considering these flowers to the right and to the left and how much of them I want to show, and like the hard edge on the left, that has to go in just 1 second. That really has to disappear there because it's too much and there's no hard edge there. And then later on I can decide, even if I want to bring out some more highlights, you know, on these flowers. Because the flower on the right, that's a very light pink, let's say peach pink, very light, almost white. So I have the option to bring that later on, which I actually don't use because I want this flower to sing into shine. And look at how it's already, it pops so much. I love that. I love the way it looks right now. Possibly one of my favorite stages. And now, again, adding these darks, and one important thing is they're blurry. I'm not going to leave any hard edges there because that can be very distracting from our focal point, from this, the white petals and the yellow in the middle. So I'm blending these in, and I'm actually taking another measure, which is bringing in my spray bottle, blocking everything, and just spraying it on the bottom left corner. That's something sometimes you'll use your hand to block. Now, I'm going to mix a bit of a darker neutral shadow. I used neutral tint as well as my primary colors, which was mostly phthalo blue, French ultramarine. The yellow is a yellow ochre here, by the way, and the red is a quinacridone rose. All by Daniel Smith, except for the yellow ochre. And we are starting to address these slightly darker sections that I told you about. Within this gray shadow, there are slightly darker sections. And now that I don't have to worry about that yellow in the middle, I can focus on them and I can give them the proper attention and take care of the edges and really work my way one petal at a time. Sorry about the beeping in the background, if there is any. There's still a lot of noise from the street. And one petal at a time, get the shape of these beautiful shadows. One of the things I love about petals, and that's actually different from birds, because I can compare these to birds because it's two subjects that allow some freedom, which is very fun, kind of like the bees we did, wet and wet. One thing where this compares to them is you can actually have a lot of freedom in you can get a lot of things wrong. It's still a very rewarding subject because of the nature of flowers and how they can be colorful. They can be, there's a variety of edges just naturally because some petals are rounded, so you get a smooth transition. Some edges are sharp. Some turns in the petal shapes are sharp, so you get a sharp transition. It really has everything, which is a lot of fun, I think, for me at least. So here we go, starting to work on that petal on the left. Again, you can very clearly see where the shadow gets darker. Now, this isn't yet the full context, okay? This will all look more correct once we address the middle section. So don't worry if things look a little incomplete right now, right? Don't judge the work in this current state. You need to be a little patient sometimes and let it play through. And again, I cannot stress this lesson enough. If you give up on your paintings midway through, you're losing out on a lot of improvement. Even if you mess up, it's worth continuing, because what ends up happening for the most part is you just kind of let go and then you end up painting something really cool. You end up utilizing the paint better because you already, quote unquote, gave up on achieving a perfect result. So there's a lot of positivity to that, and it's kind of an excuse to let go and not worry, you know? So I strive to finish every painting, even if I really dislike them all the way till the end. It's very rare for me to give up on a painting, and that's maybe if I'm completely not in the mood and I don't feel like I'll ever want to finish it, then I'll just set it aside or turn it into test paper, as sometimes happens. But yeah, now as we are going through all of these petals, we're pretty much done with this center part, so we can, with the petals, so we can move on to the center part. Now I'm pre-wetting because I'm still looking for gradual transitions. So I'm pre-wetting and now I'm introducing some paint. Now you'll barely see it, it's very thin. But then, as I start to add a bit more strength to it, in the form of adding some red to quinacridone rose into the yellow ochre, that introduces a bit of a more orange feel to it, where the middle section is a little darker, right? And I actually could have gone a lot darker, but I chose not to exaggerate the values too much here, or rather to keep them a little lighter key. And then I'm gradually going stronger and stronger because I really want to show those middles of petals where things are just dark. It's not just middle of petals, it's actually the areas that are a little more hidden from the light, generally speaking. And it's also the pollens, which you will see me putting in there, because some of them are very dark and they're just, you know, here we go. You can put some of the pollens in. And one really interesting thing about this is, notice how once we put them in, we're starting to justify the cast shadows. We're not completely there yet because we're going to add some beautiful highlights later on, you'll see. But we're getting close to there. And this actually starts to feel like a three-dimensional object. You know, all the petals converging in the middle, getting darker in the middle. So that's a very cool section of the painting process. Now we're adding these, you know, I don't know what you call this, the stem of the pollens, and that really starts to justify the shadow, because we get what we're looking at. And this happens on a subconscious level. Things look good on a subconscious level. It's pretty amazing. Now I'm going to bring in some John Brilliant, which is Shinhan PWC, beautiful opaque paint. Mix it with a bit of yellow ochre just to have it a little darker than it comes out of the tube. And look at what happens here. I'm putting in those stems for the pollens, and this really justifies some of the shadows and the shapes there, especially once we zoom out a bit and you'll see the comparison in the end result. That really tells the complete story, because in the shadows within the petal you can see a lot of these. And we're going to sign this, and I'm going to remove the tape for you. Again, keeping it relatively high key, right? I didn't go as dark as I could have in some of these sections because I still want this to shine a bit. I don't want to mute it. I don't want to have any black shadows in the middle there. But I think it looks really, really cool. And in a second, you'll see a comparison, actually, with the reference photo. Pretty close, I would say. Of course, there are a few differences, right? Again, the blue is a little warmer in the original. The shadows are a little different, but this is a small piece of paper. There's a limit to actually how many details you can get on one of these. And the larger you paint, paint, the more details you can put in. But this was a fun little subject to work on. I really hope you enjoyed this one, and if you have, I do encourage you to check out my watercolor painting courses. One of them, the frustration-free watercolor course. If you're a beginner, if you struggle with letting go with watercolor, I highly recommend you check that out. And if you're a bit more intermediate, you may want to look into the Watercolor Realism course, where I go into detail and depth on how to create a beautiful sense of realism in your paintings. So in any case, I hope you really enjoyed this one. Don't forget to leave a like, a comment, subscribe if you still aren't, and I will see you in the next video soon.